right. Hello, Yaire Sierra. Nice to have you. I'm going to give you extra credit, okay? And Areli, Areli, if you don't mind, could you type or verbally give me your last name? Thank you. That'll work. Okay, so this week, right? You guys are doing the Constitution assignment. Notice it's different in that it's not argumentative. So what I want to ask of you, okay, and I'm sorry if I wasn't specific enough, because I know I've been having some questions from the students about exactly what I'm asking of you. Um, so remember, when you address this, let's see here, there are, see here, 7 articles in the original Constitution, especially though the first 3 articles, right, through the judiciary. So I'm sorry, is there any way I could have this? And then I see a dot, 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 Sierra or Yare. So Yare, Sierra, if you could go ahead and finish your request, hun, and typing it out, so I know exactly what you're getting audio problems, right? So please type to me a little more to let me know what's going on, and I'm gonna in the meantime I'm gonna move on here, okay? So so notice, right? There at least the first 3 articles, the legislator at first, the executive second, and the judiciary third. Um, Please put an example from all 3 of those articles for sure. If you could do 7, the remaining 4, that'd be great. But put at least one example from any of those and all 3 of the first 3 articles into one of the 3 categories. All right. And I would expect at least, at the very least, 4 examples into each category. All right. I'd like more, but at least 4. Okay. And so remember the look into my subjective definition of what I hold to be enlightened, conservative, or pragmatic. All right. But I'll be happy to briefly cover that here in this video. So with enlightened, right? It's anything that pertains to the principles of the Enlightenment that were percolating in the 1740s up through the War for Independence that may have influenced the founding fathers and the Americans for that matter. So, for instance, right, anything to do with popular sovereignty, the idea that authority, powers when you proverbially hold someone down, and whenever that person can throw you off of him or her, you no longer hold that power. Authority to me is when that person gives up and says, I submit to you, you're my rightful leader. So, sovereignty, right? Authority. Okay, Angela Nguyen, welcome. Um, to me, right, with these gentlemen of this generation, they contended that, especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke, they wrote that sovereignty, authority rest by the consent of the governed, by the permission of the people, right? And so you have the notion of the social contract, whereby let's say that we were, well, let's just, what they contended was they thought at first there was a time in human history, and they're surmising, they're philosophically guessing, but they're inferring that perhaps there was a time in human history when everyone was in a state of nature, as they called it. There was no government. Everybody was just roaming as hunter and gatherers, and everyone had complete freedom. And they surmised that there may have come a time when enough people abused that freedom and began infringing upon the freedoms of other people, mainly the protection of their persons, their physical protection. So some people began to engage in acts of physical violence or extortion. Do this for me, or else I'm going to create this harm physically upon you. Um, their property, their things, right? Stealing things from one another, uh, and um, and then also they add of course, their life, their very life, not to be murdered. So at any rate, with life, liberty, and property, as these two gentlemen wrote in the key Enlightenment writings, is they contended that there must have been a time when people did the cost benefit analysis and said, I love my complete freedom, but it's being outweighed now at this point by my fear for my own life, liberty, and property. And so to them, right, government, it was initiated as a necessary evil, begrudgingly, and said, okay, fine, let's get together and create our first government, right? Um, but in doing so, that government is our servant and not our master. Whoever we elect and give our permission to rule, they're not to lord it over us. It is their role to ensure that our liberties are protected, that no one else mugs me, physically attacks me, no one else steals from me, etc. Right? So that the government is your servant, and so that whenever those who were given permission to rule initially in human history, they're surmising, failed to do their job and abused their own power or were neglectful in protecting people's rights and liberties, they were to be rightfully overthrown and replaced by a new group of leaders who would do the job more effectively. So that's the notion of the social contract and popular sovereignty, that government ought to exist by the permission of the governed, and it ought to be the servant and protector of the people, not its overlord, in protecting their liberties and rights. Okay, so anything along those lines you find in the Constitution, uh, uh, offices being elected and hence needing the permission of the governed to rule, offices having to be held accountable, any types of checks and balances where people in a certain branch or position cannot simply do as they please, but have to abide by not only checks from people from other branches, but also by the Constitution itself, which is to reign supreme and to limit what the rulers can and cannot do. All of that I would consider enlightened. Okay, so any facet of that that you see in the Constitution that you think is tied to limited government, checks and balances, popular will, accountability to the people, those would all be instances that I would put under enlightened. All right. Conservative is that you want to conserve the status quo, you want to conserve historical traditions. So, coming from the Middle Ages, especially, right? Anything that gives a lot of power to one strong central government over all the states and locales, that would be conservative, I think. Um, Anything that allows for ancient institutions that do not abide by Enlightenment precepts like the equality of all human beings, entitlement for all human beings, that would be considered conservative. So the fact that they implicitly allow slavery, right? The fact that they do not advocate universal citizenship. They could have done that because if they had really faithfully abided by the Enlightenment, they would have done that. They would have ensured that that citizenship be offered to all human beings. But instead, right, it's clear in the Constitution, they not only failed to do that, but they state that reps that are elected into the House of Reps, as well as tax allocation, is to be decided by whomever the state decides to be citizens. So they rendered it to the states to be able to decide that issue. So to me, that's conservative. Any issue in which the government can raise an army against its own people, against domestic insurrections and rebellion, raise an army and declare war, and even use it against its own population, that clearly is conservative. Okay. Then pragmatic. Pragmatic to me is just amoral. It doesn't necessarily think about what principles are right or wrong, or even for that matter, yeah, I'll stick to that, just right or wrong. What they contend, right, is their decisions, a pragmatic decision brings about good practical results. So one example of pragmatism in the Constitution was getting the South to be okay with the Constitution. Not only because they were okay with slavery and they were very jealously guarding their rights to keep their slaves, but also a lot of the Southerners were libertarian. Government don't tread on me, right? And so a lot of the states' rights, gentlemen, were found in the South and in the small states like Delaware and New Jersey and Connecticut. etc. So you had a guy named Roger Sherman. You had a guy named Charles Pinckney. They were states' rights guys at the Constitutional Convention. So so anything that, let's say that they decided, okay, we're going to give the federal government some powers and we're going to leave other powers to the states. That would be considered a pragmatic uh, solution, a pragmatic compromise, so that the states' rights guys would be okay with this stronger federal government. Anything that gave the implicit okay for slavery, right? And also had the 20-year gag rule that no one in Congress could even bring up the slave issue, much less make a decision on it for 20 years until the year 1808. That may have been a pragmatic decision. It was amoral. They weren't thinking about what's right or wrong morally, but how they were going to compromise with the Southern reps to get them to ratify this Constitution as well. Anything in the name of law and order, or just that seems very practical. Maybe the age requirements, right? For the House reps, senators, and president, they had to be 25, 30, and 35 years old. Maybe that was just a good pragmatic decision. So, like I said, very often I love finding a student putting a part of an article under one of the three categories that I subjectively wouldn't have initially put it under. And I ask you, just in one sentence alone is fine. That will suffice for me. Is defend why you put it under enlightened or conservative or pragmatic. And sometimes I learn from the students. I really do. I literally kind of think to myself like, wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. That's a pretty intelligent point. All right. And so are there any questions about the assignment? Anybody have any more questions about it? Okay. So a few themes that I want to cover as we get into this assignment, if you don't mind. And let's kind of jump right into them. Is for one, right, is there was largely consensus at the Constitutional Convention that something stronger as a government and more centralized needed to be done. You have examples, right, of people that in many ways were kind of on the left, and I'm going to explain that soon, like Elbridge Gerry, right, or let's see here, George Mason. They were very big into popular sovereignty. They wanted the republic to lean more toward a democracy than toward an aristocracy or a monarchy, because a republic, right, is a mixture of all three. Um, but people like George Mason and Elbridge Gerry, even they admitted that there needs to be national supremacy. Um, and so even Jefferson, who was Mr. States' Rights, libertarian, liberal, right? He kind of stayed away and was very quiet regarding the Constitutional Convention. So some people say that he almost resigned to the fact like, okay, this goes against my philosophy, having a stronger central government, but I'm not going to fight it. And there are various interpretations as to why he didn't, but some go so far as to say that deep down he knew begrudgingly that a stronger central government needed to be established. Okay, so that's one common theme that you find at the Constitutional Convention. Another one are the left and right. Let's get into that, okay? Supposedly when the Gironde were behind the French Revolution, as a class and as like a political faction during the French Revolution. They had those who wanted the most radical change, like the Jacobins, sit on the left wing of the Estates General Chamber. And those who wanted as much of tradition to be preserved sat on the right wing of that Estates General body. And so to this day, broadly, we use the terms left and right. So just broadly, that's what Yare, I'm very sorry that you can't hear me. All I can assure you is that I'll have this recorded and put on. I'll have it put on Canvas, and you will certainly get your extra credit, even if you end up signing off out of frustration right now. I apologize. I'm not familiar enough with this system to even begin to know how to help you. Okay, so with the left, right, generically, that's people who want to radically change tradition. Okay, and like I said, things that were considered traditional to the left that they were against. For one, was a combination of church and state, right? They were against that. They were against aristocratic government. Remember, Aristoi means the best. And so aristocracy literally call themselves the best and feel like they're entitled to rule over everybody else. So they were against aristocracy and having a nobility, right? The left was against mercantilism of the past, of wanting to only the king had the prerogative or queen to decide to whom to allocate what economic opportunities and resources. And they were unapologetic about it, not giving everyone the same economic opportunities. So the left was tired of that and ready to sway away from that, right? And of course, the left was against any type of arbitrary rule, where any governing officials could simply arbitrarily, without rhyme or reason, do as they please, be inconsistent, violate their own rhetoric, go against traditions from the past, etc., by simply claiming, kind of like Louis XIV of France, I am the state and I could do what I please as your king or queen. So the left was clearly against all of those things, okay, amongst our founding fathers and anyone on the left for that matter on the political spectrum in the late 1700s period. So those to the right didn't want to deviate too far from those traditional things, okay? So what I make the argument of, okay, is I think in the short run, we are going to benefit from the fact that I subjectively, I want to qualify this, believe that our political spectrum of left to right was very narrow compared to other places in the world. So for instance, in Latin America, right, you had people like Francisco de Miranda and others who wanted a complete overhaul of land distribution and to literally give out and distribute land to the poor, peasants, and the indigenous, and the ex-slaves, etc., right? Economically, that's very radical. Others like Francisco de Miranda as well were for, and Vicente Guerrero, were for having a very decentralized democratic government. The people in all their regions to decide, and not to mention have universal citizenship. Sorry, ladies, not for women. They weren't ready for that yet. But for men at least, regardless of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whether you pay taxes or own property or not, okay, that they democratically rule. That's radical, okay? And then, of course, socially, those on the far left were egalitarians. They wanted the equality of all men, regardless of any demographic differences in category. So at any rate, then also on the right, to the contrary, in Latin America, you had people who wanted to implement a king or an emperor, keep an established nobility where they unapologetically alone get to trade in the big money makers, get access to land, etc., and without any apology. You had some that far on the right who wanted a constitution, but not one that limited too much the powers of the autocrat or the aristocracy, right? They wanted to keep church and state wedded together, okay, under the Catholic Church. So to me, that's pretty far to the left and that's pretty far to the right for that time period. But let's contrast the founding fathers, right? You look at our left, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, right? These gentlemen merely wanted a republic that tilted a little bit heavier toward a democratic republic than toward an aristocratic or monarchical republic. So a republic, right? You have elected, you have representative democracy, you have the citizens elect, right? Their leaders, but then you have an upper branch, as the founding fathers established. And you'll notice originally in this Constitution, the Senate was elected by the state legislators, not the citizens. So that's one step removed from representative democracy. So only the House reps are elected by citizens. Then the senators have a check and have to agree with legislation and also pass it by majority along with the House. Then you have a president and vice president who are elected by the electoral college system, not by direct vote, right? And so that's one step removed from representative democracy. And then they handpicked their own cabinet members as well as Supreme Court justices and ambassadors. So if you look at House reps, senators, the executive, and the judiciary, of those four different segments of the government, only one of the four, only the House reps, were elected by citizens. And the liberals were okay with this. So, meaning the liberals were not that democratic. And as we're going to get into later with Jefferson, he admitted and agreed with John Adams in a debate that he felt like the majority of citizens will get things wrong very often, because to him the majority of citizens were a bit ignorant, uneducated, and perhaps not well equipped to rule. But to him, necessarily, right, the democratic element to the republic was a lesser evil. That he felt like the mistakes and poor decisions made by the elected reps and the common people that voted him in will be less pernicious, less dangerous to the liberties of the republic and to the people therein, as opposed to what they thought was a bigger evil, senators and presidents who knew exactly what they were doing and dealt nefariously with the people, parasitically, for their own enrichment at the expense of the masses. So again, to the left, right, they were not for universal citizenship, not even for men. Jefferson said that Native American men needed to assimilate and become like the white man before it would even be considered an option to let them be given citizenship rights. He said African Americans, he adhered to the Sambo image and thought that they were biologically, by nature, ill-equipped, intelligence-wise, self-control-wise, to be good citizens. Very racist, right, by today's standards. And that's Mr. Liberal, Thomas Jefferson. So to me, our left was really not far to the left on the spectrum. They did not want democratic rule. They wanted a republic of mixed government, right? And where only one of the four major sectors was elected. They were not for a universal citizenship, even a male universal citizenship, to elect those House reps. And so, and not to mention, including Jefferson, many of them, while Jefferson spoke well as Madison against slavery, they didn't put their money where their mouth was as far as really trying to get legislation passed, much less even giving up their own slaves. And so at any rate, right, the left to me was not that far to the left on the spectrum. Then you go to the right. Yes, we had people like Hamilton who wanted a one-man executive. When they were at the Constitutional Convention and a gentleman stood up, right, and stated that he advocated having one-man executive, they said that it got deathly quiet in the convention because they felt torn, evidently, is the common interpretation to this, to James Madison's notes of what was going on in that convention, is they contended that people got very quiet because they did not want another King George III, especially under the guise of being president, right? And matter of fact, Randolph even said he was fearful that the executive would become the fetus, the newborn baby to the monarch. The president will be another king, just with another name. So it was very controversial, but Hamilton was for that. Hamilton would even dabble with the idea of promoting the president serving for life and not being directly elected. So that's clearly to the right. That's old school, right? Hamilton and Madison both had concerns about the common people. They felt like the common person was not capable of making good political decisions, right? And so hence, they believed that by nature and nurture. They had read their Aristotle and Plato, and both those Greek philosophers were very elitist and snobbish toward democracy. They felt like the average person was not intelligent enough, and also lacked the self-control and virtue to be able to rule well. And so hence, right, what the those on the right said is that they wanted to have the House reps trusted as stewards, as like babysitters of the people's power, right? Stewardship, like I said, to me is like a babysitter. You entrust something sacred to you to someone else, and you allow yourself to be at that other person's mercy with that which you consider sacred. So literally, James Madison likens elected reps to filters, to men who are much more capable of making wise decisions than the people who elected them. And they should be trusted to use their own virtue, their own education, their own intellect to make wise decisions on behalf of those that voted them in, their constituents. And so I liken it today, right, like to the notion that do you believe that all human beings are entitled to the same rights, protections under the law, and opportunities in life? That's kind of a rhetorical question, right? We all should believe in that, coming from modern post-enlightenment, post-liberal Western civilization. However, do you believe everyone is equally capable of writing an English paper for you, of fixing your car? And of course, that's another rhetorical question, the answer to which is no, right? People differ in their talents. They differ in how well they've been trained in a given area of life. So likewise, that was the argument of our right, is they said, we'll trust the common citizens to simply know when there's someone better than themselves, right? That they're going to see talent, they're going to know talent when they see it. And we're going to trust just their wisdom to elect people more capable than themselves. And they thought it by nature and nurture, right? That people just by nature, some are more intelligent and capable of ruling, but also by nurture, as they thought that especially those in the well-to-do class have access to education that the common people don't have, and have access to leisure, time to sit and read things and ponder things and live an intellectual lifestyle. So by nature and nurture, they felt like they wanted the cream of the crop to be elected into the House of Reps, right? And they were very arrogant toward the common people. But again, they still wanted a democratically elected House of Reps that had power to raise money and start issues with taxes. They had to pass their body of a majority plus one to make a law. They had power by a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. Those on the right were okay with that, with having a democratic republic, right? They didn't want a divine right king. They wanted the Constitution to be the lay of the land and to limit what every politician could or could not do, right? And also, like Hamilton, many of those on the right, ironically, were against slavery and for the rights of slaves to at least be freed, if not be enfranchised and be given citizenship rights and inclusion into society. So to me, that's not that far to the right. Not to mention those on the right wanted a separation of church and state. Those on the right, however begrudgingly, ratified and were okay with a Bill of Rights to give individual stated rights to all citizens, right? So again, to me, the right was not very far to the right. The left was not very far to the left. So in the short run, I subjectively think that really helped them be able to compromise, for one, and establish a constitution and then ratify it in their states, 9 of the 13. But it also helped with peaceful transitions of power, whereby when one party and someone on the left won an election, the people on the right did not rise in rebellion and try a coup, C-O-U-P, a military blow to the state and overthrow them by force, or a revolution or a civil war. They waited and bided their time for the next election to try again. Likewise, when someone won on the right, the left stayed back, stayed peaceful, and waited to bide their time for the next campaign. But to me, it's because when in 1796, John Adams runs on the right and the left says, don't vote for John Adams. He's going to reinstitute an aristocracy. He is going to become a monarch. He's going to declare class warfare against the poor. And he is going to unite us back, at least in diplomacy, with Great Britain. Then the left, on the right, they said, don't vote for the left guy, who was Thomas Jefferson. He is going to reinstitute, or he's going to finish off what he's seen in France with a French Revolution, whereby, like the Jacobins, he's going to declare war against the rich, confiscate their property, maybe even behead them, like the Jacobins were killing all the noblemen of France by public executions. So, but when Adams won in 1796, the men behind Jefferson and Jefferson himself stepped down and waited for 1800 to run again. When Jefferson won in 1800, however begrudgingly, John Adams left office as a one-term president and let the system be retained without violence. But to me, it's because all that rhetoric during the campaigns, I subjectively think, was hyperbole. It was exaggerated, deliberate, manipulative exaggeration to try to frighten people away from voting for their opponent. Okay. But deep down, I think they knew their opponent was really not that far to the left or really not that far to the right, and really shared a lot of fundamental assumptions with himself. And so hence that was easier for them to allow for peaceful transitions of power. So that to me was a short run gain for our ideological spectrum between left and right being pretty narrow compared to the rest of the world. But what's bad, right, is not having someone really that far to the left for their time period and wanting radical change. No one seriously took on the big issues like citizenship rights for all human beings, right? They're going to kick that can down the road of slavery. They're going to kick that can down the road of having a universal pledge of citizenship for all people, right? That's not going to come, you guys, until the end of the Civil War through the 14th Amendment. That's a long time away. So at any rate, right, it was, to me, it was bittersweet. And it's going to help lead to the drama that's going to, future generations are going to have to face when they seriously contemplate human rights for all people in this country. All right. So that's my blabbing 2 cents on the Constitutional Convention. I don't think left and right were that far apart from each other, which I think was bittersweet. Are there any questions? All right. And so, like the major compromises, I'm sure you've been familiar with from high school. And so, states' rights versus central power, compromise over slavery, compromise over citizenship, letting each state decide for itself, compromise over representation. The small states wanted the same number no matter what, so they couldn't be outvoted on everything. And the bigger states wanted it by population. So the House reps by population, the senators are two no matter what from each state. Uh, of course, the checks and balances involved compromise for people from different philosophical backgrounds. The president having veto power over legislation, they could by 2/3 majority override it. They can impeach the president. The president handpicks Supreme Court justices for life, and the Supreme Court justices are to be subservient to the Constitution and make decisions on the constitutionality. Well, actually, that's not originally in the Constitution. Um, so, yeah, so again, are there any questions? Any questions on the assignment for this week? So enlightened, conservative, or pragmatic. Please put at least 4 examples in each of those 3, and please use an example from at least all of the first 3 articles. Not everything in them, of course not. Okay, you're very welcome, Ms. Sierra. So good, that's great. I'm glad that you were able to improvise. I would not have been intelligent enough to do that. So do we separate by section? No. So don't worry about, just separate by category alone. So I have no problem with you saying enlightened and throwing an example of all legislation starts with, especially legislation to raise taxes, starts with the democratically elected House reps, and that they have 2-year terms and have to be reelected, and that they have to reside in the area where they represent, right, to truly represent and have consent of the governed of the people around them. Those all enlightened, right? And then suddenly you jump to number 2 and say, okay, cite something from the executive or the judiciary as your second example of enlightened. I have no problem with you jumping around with the 3. There need not be any order involved, okay? But again, please use 1 sentence at least to describe explain why you put that in that section, why you think it's conservative or enlightened or pragmatic. Okay, at least 4 examples in all 3 categories, and give me an example from at least all of the first 3 articles from all 3 branches. Okay. All right, so if that's it, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. Thank you, those of you who are here. I have your names down, and I'll let you know when I submit comments on your graded assignments that I'm going to add at least 10 points to one of your graded assignments for making it to this conference. All right. So thank you. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to bid you adieu, and you guys have a good day and a good week. Okay. All right. Thank you.